In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Pyromancer build. This is a 100% spellcaster build that's aimed at New Game Plus that only uses fire magic. First of all, I want to tell you why this is a New Game Plus build. In order to get all the equipment you need for this build, you have to make it about 3/4 or more of the way through the game, and you have to go a lot of different places and know a lot about a lot of different locations. So I feel like by the time you get all of this equipment needed for this build, you're going to be mostly done with a playthrough, and you really won't get to experience using this build for 90% of your playthrough. So this is a build that you can play from the very beginning of New Game Plus as is, and it is a ton of fun to play. So let's jump into the equipment real quick before we get into the spells and how to use them in this build. The first thing we're using is the Erdtree Seal. This has 353 incantations, scaling at 80 faith at +10 upgrade. This thing is basically the best seal you can use that's a pure faith scaling seal at 80 faith. So if you are casting, just a general incantation build, then this is what you want to be if you hitting that 80 faith mark, which we are in this build. And that'll allow us to cast spells with very, very high incantation scaling. And in our offhand, we use the Giant Seal. This is to give us a +20% damage boost to the spells that we're using in this build. This will allow us to get the higher incantation scaling of the Erdtree Seal when we're casting, but also get the 20% damage boost by holding this in our offhand. You don't even need to upgrade this, you just need to hold it in your offhand. And you can also use the Godslayer's Seal and rotate between these if you're using the Black Flame incantation as well. There is a case to use it in this build, but it's not one that we use very often. When it comes to armor for this build, I'm using the Perfumer set and just kind of mixed and matched a couple between the Perfumer Traveler and Perfumer Noble set. Really, you just need some sort of armor that allows you to medium or light roll. Ideally, I think you'd probably light roll with this build. That'll give you more roll distance when you're rolling, which is great. Doesn't really matter whether you have medium or light armor, as long as it's not heavy rolling. You can use whatever you like here. There are helmets that give you faith, which would be nice for this build, but it's just such a little amount of faith. It's not super important to the build, and it's not going to make or break it at all. When it comes to the talismans I use, I have the Fire Scorpion Charm to increase our fire damage, which all our spells are fire damage, so that's perfect. We have the Ritual Sword Talisman that increases all of our damage by 10% when we're at max health, which you're going to be aiming to be most of the time with this build, or all of the time. We have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, which gives us even more physical defense. You don't have a lot of physical defense when you're wearing light armor, especially since we're using the Fire Scorpion Charm. So this is a good way to add some to this build. Golden Vow will, of course, give you some defense as well, but this will give you even more. And lastly, we have Godfrey Icon, which increases the damage of your spells that are charged. We have 3 spells here that are chargeable, or 4 spells if you're using Black Flame. So that's 4 out of 5. That's pretty good. Another talisman you could use here is Flock's Canvas Talisman to further increase your incantation damage. You can replace Godfrey Icon with this if you want, if you find you're not charging spells that often. Or you can replace the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman if you want more damage and you're not really getting hit that often. So with those things being said, let's jump into the spells that we use for this build. The first one is Burn O Flame. This is sort of like an AoE fire spell. You might remember seeing this in Demon Souls and Dark Souls. They have versions of this spell where you kind of put your hands into the ground and fire columns come up. This is a very, very situational spell. It's probably the least used of all the magic I use, but where it really excels is when you can get under big enemies like dragons. Because each flame column can hit the dragon for its own damage, if you get under a dragon with this spell, you can absolutely melt them. Or any other big enemy you can get onto, but this is primarily dragons. So this is kind of your dragon killer spell, and maybe a couple other enemies, but predominantly that enemy type. The next spell we use for this build is Flame of the Fell God. This is a spell that shoots up a fireball into the air that goes a medium distance and then detonates. So it kind of like locks onto the target, tries to home onto it, and then it'll detonate after a little ways. It doesn't go very far, so it's best used on aggressive bosses or aggressive difficult enemies before you aggro them. So you cast this, aggro them immediately so that they run at you, and then that thing will detonate as they're on their way to you. If they aren't very aggressive, you have to get really close in order for this to hit, which you can still do, assuming they don't know that you're there. But it's harder to use in a close range scenario, when an enemy is right up on you. It's better to use, initially trigger an enemy that moves toward you and then gets exploded by that spell as they're moving towards you. It's a very, very good setup spell. I like casting this at the beginning of boss fights before I switch to something like Giant's Flame Take Thee. in order to get like a really good burst damage between these two spells as they detonate at the same time. So next up, obviously, is Giant's Flame Take Thee. This is sort of your bread and butter boss killer spell or difficult enemy spell. This thing hits like an absolute truck. It has a huge FP cost, so it's not something you're going to use all the time. But anytime you're facing like a boss or any difficult enemy, this is what you're going to want to use. And you're going to want to try and charge this up if you can for extra damage on the spell itself, extra damage from Godfrey Icon, and also a bigger explosion radius. This thing not only is really good against single bosses, but it's also really good when enemies are very tightly packed together. If you want to just wipe out a small group of enemies that are tightly packed together, this is a great way to do it. So also use it in those scenarios, and it can be used from horseback as well, which is great. We also are using Flame Fall Upon Them here, and this spell is kind of your regular use spell. If you're playing an incantation build, previous builds I've made, usually this would be your Black Flame. You know, you're casting against 18 FP cost, which is kind of expensive, but not super expensive for what it does, particularly since we have a lot of FP with this build. But this is your go-to spell for when you're facing regular enemies. It'll usually one-shot most enemies, particularly if they don't know you're there. And it sort of fans out in an AoE, which is great because it can take out packs of enemies. It's kind of like a shotgun burst. And also, if you're fighting a big enemy, multiple fireballs from this can hit them if you're far enough away, dealing individual damage per fireball, which can work really well. Again, I advise using Giant's Flame Take Thee if you're going to fight a single target. But this does have, you know, its uses if you're fighting like a big enemy or several big enemies at once, or a big enemy and a bunch of small enemies. You can kind of hit all of them at the same time, which is great. And another thing that I really like about this spell is it's really, really effective on horseback. Enemies typically while you're riding around can move out of the way, or if they're on horseback, can be hard to hit with Black Flame. This kind of solves that problem. You know, if you're fighting like the Tree Sentinels or something, you're not going to miss while they're flying around, or Knights Cavalry. This thing will just hit them. You know what I mean? It's a fans out and it'll hit them. And a lot of times, it will not only hit the target you're aiming at, but other targets as well. And that makes it, in my opinion, a better use than Black Flame a lot of the time. Even though Black Flame tends to have more damage than this spell, you still typically one-shot enemies with this spell, so it's not a huge factor even in NG+. And the last offensive spell, which is optional, is Black Flame. You can use Black Flame for when you need a little bit more distance. Sometimes, like, Giant's Flame Take Thee just doesn't have a very long distance, and Black Flame can get you further in order to pick something off. Usually Flame Fall Upon Them has really good distance too, so it's harder to be accurate over longer range than Black Flame, but it's still usually pretty accurate. So you can kind of juggle these, and you can use the Gloodslayer seal in your left hand if you find yourself using Black Flame. But I don't use Black Flame hardly at all in this build, but I just wanted you to know that it's an option. If you want to add it to this build, you can. Besides these things, we have Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Golden Vow obviously increases your damage and gives you protection. Both great for this build. Has a pretty long duration, so you can buff with this regularly, even from horseback, increase your spell damage. And then Flame Grant You Strength is going to increase your fire damage. All your spells are fire damage, so this is great. Doesn't have a long duration, so you typically use this when you walk into boss fights or before a tough enemy in order to give you a bit of an edge so you can kill something really, really quickly. There are lots of other fire spells you can use with this build, but personally, I found these ones to be the most effective. If you sort of use the spells I suggested in their given scenarios, I don't think you really have a need for other fire spells. So you can add them if you want, but I don't recommend it. When it comes to stats for this build, at level 158, I have 50 Vigor, 50 Mind, 12 Endurance, 8 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 80 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence or Arcane for this build, or Strength at all, or Dexterity even. You don't need any of those 4 stats. Those stats are simply what they are because I started as an Astrologer. If you started as a different class, you're going to have a more optimized stat spread here because you won't have wasted points in those things. 50 Vigor is to give you enough health in order to survive hits. You have decent protection when you're buffed with Golden Vow, and you have Dragon Crest Great Shield. You're sitting at about 30% resistance, which is not bad for really light armor, but you'll probably want to take this up to 60 throughout NG+. 50 Mind is there because all you're doing with this build is casting spells. Every single attack you do is a spell cast. You use FP with every attack, and some of these spells cost a lot of FP. Golden Vow is an expensive buff, so you need tons and tons of FP. This gives you 300 FP with this build, which allows you to cast and not worry about your FP. You should have at least 7 or so blue flasks. You can split them in half and go 7 and 7. Or you can go, more FP if you find you need even more FP. It really is up to you, but you should have tons of FP with this build because we have prepared for that. And lastly, we have 80 Faith in order to hit the last soft cap for our seals. You'll probably want to take this up to 99 at some point. You're not going to get a lot more damage out of it, but Essentially, the only 3 stats you need for this build are Vigor, Mind, and Faith. You can increase Endurance if you want, which I put a couple points here, to give you more stamina for casting, and also to increase your equip load so at some point you're light rolling. But you really only need Vigor, Mind, and Faith. So at some point, you're not going to need any more Mind. At some point, Vigor is not going to be worth putting points into, and then you'll just keep increasing Faith until you get up to 99. And just a couple of tips before I wrap up this build video. If you're using the Flask of Wonders Physique, you're going to want to use the Fire Shroud and Crackter, obviously, to increase your fire damage, which is great. All your spells are fire damage. And you can either use the Green Burst tier in order to increase your stamina recovery, or you can use the Cerulean Hidden tier in order to give you like 10 seconds of basically free spell casting. I usually use this and then buff with my buffs, so I don't have any FP from my bar drain when I start a fight. You have tons of FP, so it's not like you're going to run out quickly in a fight, so you don't necessarily need this one. But it can be nice to save you an FP flask when you go into a boss fight. And lastly, if you're talking about which Great Rune you should use for this build, this is not a super stat-hungry build, so I don't recommend using Godric's Great Rune. Shocking, I know. But actually, Radahn's Great Rune is great for this build because it increases your HP, FP, and stamina. You don't have a lot of points in endurance in this build, so getting more stamina is good. More FP is good for spellcasting, and more HP is good for staying alive. So that's the one I would recommend using for this build because it gives you all those things you need. You don't really need a ton more stats. So that wraps up the Pyromancer build. We have more build guides coming for New Game Plus. We also have more weapon guides, so stay tuned for those. If you have suggestions on which builds you'd like to see or which weapons or spells, please let me know in the comments below. I am reading these, and it is dictating the sort of builds that I make.